Welcome to City Cinematheque, where the art and pleasure of the movies are the subject of serious discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach film studies at the City College of the City University of New York. Today, we have a series revisiting neorealism. We're going to be looking in the next couple of weeks at a number of films that do something a little bit different while being neorealist. Today's film is the 1962 war film, The 4 Days of Naples, directed by Nanni Loy. This is a story of the resistance of the Italian people of the Neapolitans against the Nazi occupation. It's extraordinary. It was nominated for 3 Academy Awards. After today's screening, we'll be chatting about the film with Professor Jacqueline Reich of Marist University, a noted expert on the history of Italian film. Now, join the resistance in The 4 Days of Naples. Welcome back to City Cinematheque. Wow, that's one way to liberate a city. There's a lot to talk about in this film, and it's not a film as well known as many of us think it should be, because it is a major film of Italian cinema and nominated for 3 Academy Awards. To talk about that and much, much more, it's a real pleasure to have back on City Cinematheque a good friend of the series, Professor Jacqueline Reich of Marist University. She's a noted expert on Italian film history, specialty in celebrity and actors. She's also currently serving as the president of the American Society of Italian Studies. Welcome back, Jackie.
Thanks, Jerry. Great to be here.
Great. And just as a reminder to both of us, one of our other conversations was about one of the early masterpieces of Italian neorealism, Rome Open City by Roberto Rossellini. So let's actually start with that classic period just as a kind of reminder to folks. So what in just a, in a few sort of concepts, what happens, what is the birth of neorealism? Now, the film we're talking about is 15 years or more later, but let's talk about this period at the end of the war and what was accomplished in neorealism in its initial chapter.
Okay, thanks. Great to be back, and thank you for introducing me to this film, which, believe it or not, I had not heard of before, and it was just a revelation. But let's backtrack a little bit.
Okay, sure.
So when we talk about the birth of neorealism, we kind of talk about a gradual emergence of a style that starts actually during the fascist period with some early films like one of Visconti's earliest called Ossessione, which I'm sure you've shown here, yes. And also a De Sica film called The Children Are Watching Us. And we start to see a new kind of cinematic expression that is designed to tell a story that is real, that is true, and that has a historical anchoring.
Okay. And
so eventually a style develops through a kind of a convergence of different filmmakers. There are also different activities that they participated in, university cinema clubs. Many of them started at the film school, and there was also a journal that many of them contributed to. And so this new kind of expression, a new kind of cinematic expression comes around, and we move to films like Rome Open City, right, Shoeshine, La Terra Trema, in which we have a kind of style, and that style is a specific way of telling a story with as little intervention as possible. That's the goal. Right. You and I know both this is cinema, and that's practically impossible. Right. But they do certain things to evoke what we would call a realist aesthetic. Okay. And they have on-location shooting, a lot of non-professional actors, very simple stories, right? Think of Bicycle Thieves, right? Right. Unemployed man needs a bike, right? To be employed. Bike gets stolen, spends the rest of the film looking for the bike. Looking for the bike, yeah. Right, very simple. At the same time, these are politically committed stories, whether they are revealing the atrocities of the war, talking about poverty, talking about unemployment in the post-war era, talking about political struggles during the post-war era. So we're looking roughly around a period, 1943 to 1954, is when we think about real neorealism. The neo part, of course, being the political aspect of it.
Right, and the political aspect is, as you said, it begins during the fascist period, but even though it's during the fascist period, it's against that, and it's this pushback. I will mention what you and I both use in the lectures when we do this. It's a pushback against the so-called white telephone movies, the Italian film industry's imitation of a highly artificial Hollywood style in which that was called white telephone because the first scene is always the one in which the maid picks up the beautiful white telephone in the beautiful Roman apartment and says that no, señorita is no longer is not there, and this being the kind of ultimate studio creation of an alternative reality, as opposed to, as you've just been talking about, going out on the street or to the fishermen or to the village and shooting on location and capturing the at least the illusions being created is that the camera is capturing something that is there in front of it in a kind of way that has not been manipulated in the way of pretending that everybody in Rome has a white telephone.
Exactly. And I think one of the myths associated with neorealism is that there was this kind of snap and everything changed, right? And while there were many white telephone films, there were also many films that started pushing the boundaries during the fascist period. And so we finally convalesce, right? Or coalesce, not convalesce, but we coalesce around this kind of style, right? That emerges and becomes, you know, slowly, not immediately, recognized, right? There's the long story about how Rome Open City, and we've talked about this, was not immediately hailed as a masterpiece, right? It took a little while for people to get used to this kind of style. And so it moves forward during this period with experimentation, pushing a little bit of boundaries. Fellini comes in, pushes some boundaries, right? You have a film like La Strada, right? Somewhat neorealist, somewhat fantastical, right? And then ultimately a film like Luchino Visconti's Senso, which, while very much talking about rebellion against power, still is very sumptuous.
Right, absolutely.
And in its splendor, in color, right?
Yeah. So let's do the flash forward from you know, this early to mid 50s, in which now the economic miracle is beginning to get some traction in Italy. There are forces that do not necessarily want to promote neorealism because that's the past, and this is the emergent industrial power of the actual modernized democratic Italy. So when we get to this film in the early 1960s, how would you describe the trends in Italian cinema at that particular moment? It's now almost 10 years later, and where does this film fit in with that? And then we'll get into the film itself.
Well, 1960 is a really pivotal year in Italian cinema. We have the release of Fellini's La Dolce Vita, we have Antonioni's La Ventura, and then we have Luchino Visconti's Rocco and His Brothers, which take very different tracks in terms of discussing current phenomena, right? Whether existentialist, like La Ventura, materialist, like La Dolce Vita, or political and melodramatic, like Visconti, right? I have to say Rocco and His Brothers is one of my all-time favorite films.
Which we have screened here on City Cinematheque proudly.
It's great film. And so that's one, that kind of emergence of the Italian auteur, right? Fellini had already been known worldwide, right? He'd already won 2 Oscars by that point. But then he goes and breaks it wide open with La Dolce Vita, right? Followed up later by 8½. Then you have, at the same time, the wonderful comedy Italian styles, which use comedy to subvert, to bring out a kind of subversive and satirical message about contemporary Italian society, and undercutting, again, some of the joys of the economic boom, showing the other side through humor, So you have A Big Deal on Madonna Street, one of my all-time favorites. You have a film like Il Sorpasso, and then you have another film which kind of leads me into the third area, which is called Tutti a Casa, by Luigi Comencini, 1960, with Alberto Sordi, meaning everybody's go home,
Yeah, okay.
kind of everybody, let's go home. And it covers the same period as this film does. That is that very tricky period known as the Armistice,
Right.
When Mussolini surrenders and Badoglio, he is replaced by Badoglio. And you have a period where nobody's really sure who's in charge, right? And so it's wonderfully led by Sordi in this very comic way, but then it also leads us to a third avenue, which is a kind of retelling of many of these historical tales of resistance, through a decidedly anti-fascist lens and a communist lens, right? When we can go back to, and that's where I think the neo-realist legacy is. But I would add, and we can discuss this, that there is an incredible stylistic sophistication to something like the 4 Days of Naples that we don't have in some of the other ones, and a deliberate stylistic trajectory. So, for instance, we do know that it had a very large budget.
Yeah, talk about that.
So it had at the time an $800,000 budget, right? We're used to thinking of neorealist films as being shot on a shoestring, right? That they're okay. We're going to make it with the available light and reused film stock, right? But $800,000 was a lot of money at the time.
Absolutely.
And you notice that in the recreation of the battle scenes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And you also notice that in the way in which the editing, right, the close-ups, the alternations between the way the characters, right, their faces tell the story, right, which makes me think of another Italian filmmaker, and that's Pier Paolo Pasolini, who talked about the importance of Italian faces, right, and having real Italian faces to tell a real Italian story. So I think that all kind of combines in this film, and that represents that third area of Italian cinema, of course, with overlaps.
Yeah,
right?
no, these, it's convenient to separate the threads, and to say, well, this is the yellow thread, this is the, this is the purple thread, or whatever. But they're all of a weave, and they do interact with one another. So let's talk about. I'm now talking to a scholar who has done much work, for example, on the career of Marcello Mastroianni, et cetera. But one of the unusual things about this film is there are some actors who are going to become very, very important in here, but one of the most conspicuous aspects of this is not a star-driven piece in any way. So what's that about? I mean, why is that a key characteristic of the film, and how does it fit in with this idea of telling Italian, the history of Italy's involvement in World War II?
So there are many myths and realities about collective resistance. Right, in the resistance during, in the rebellions during this particular time, and also during the fascist period. Right. And during the Civil War between 1943 and 1945. And it is almost always a tale of collective resistance, right? There are some heroes that we hear about, but really it is the group, right, that comes together. And the actors believed, many of whom were very committed political filmmakers, or actors. So you could think of Gianmaria Volonté, right? Who
plays the captain.
Correct, and who went on to star in so many wonderful political films like Investigation of a Citizen Above Suspicion, or one of my favorites, Todo Modo with Mastroianni, right? Many of these films were directed by Elio Petri, right? And so he, being a very committed political person, and many of the others decide, we don't want any credit. No credit here. We're going to be billed as uncredited. The real stars are the people of Naples, who are the non-professional actors who populate the film. Let me also say, and step back for a minute, that during neorealism, we did have some films with purely non-professional actors, but it was more often than not a mix of professional and non-professional actors.
So Here, you've got some very interesting decisions that are being made that are coincident with the budget. You've got a huge cast that can really be the people, but then you've got some of the professional actors who can lead us through the stories in this utterly convincing way. And and you have some people who have to be really trained, and you don't just come on the set and use a machine gun.
Right.
I mean, that is something that requires the training of all the people to do things like that. Yeah.
No, absolutely. So you could think of someone like Lea Masari,
Okay.
who had already she began to emerge as a star, as an important Italian actress. She passed away recently, actually, and went that very year, made La Ventura. Right, she's the one who disappears. Right, and so this kind of mix of professional and non-professional is something that is a hallmark, right, of Italian cinema, and sometimes still continues to be a hallmark of Italian cinema. And then I want to acknowledge the work of one of my colleagues, Catherine O'Raw, who has written a brilliant book about non-professional actors in neorealism. And in that work, she talks about also the child actor.
Oh, let's please.
Okay, so one of the things where we see a kind of continuity between early neorealist films and this film is the role of children in the partisan fight. Right, we can think of the boys of Rome Open City, going back to our episode there, right, which was actually based on a real band of partisans who worked to rebel against the Germans, right? And so here we have an actual figure. His name is Gennaro Capuzzo, and he attacked German tanks and died as a result, right? And so he's that little boy in the film. And this was the only movie he ever made. Right? And so that idea of the child, what does the child represent? Right? The child represents innocence, but also represents a kind of lost youth here, and an incredible commitment to a cause. Right? And we watch him during the film. We watch him grow up. Right? We watch many of these Neapolitans, right, who were who really just said, this is not happening in my city. I am not allowing this to happen in this period from September 28th to October 1st, right, 1943. I'm going to throw furniture out the window. One of my favorite scenes in the film.
Absolutely, extraordinary scene.
Right. I'm going to throw my furniture out the window. The women are going to march up to that truck, and they're going to say, you are not taking my men. Again, a kind of very interesting comparison to the famous scene in Open City, right, where Pina runs after
and is killed, and and which goes against normal expectations of how you cut that, because if she's going to be shot, you've got to set it up. She's going to be shot, whereas in Rome Open City, it just happens. And he said, "Wait, something just happened. The camera captured. It wasn't. That wasn't supposed to happen, but it did happen." And that kind of technique is used in this film. I'm also interested in this oscillation, I'll call it that, between these scenes that you've just described so well, of this genuine collective action, the dropping of the furniture, the surrounding of this, and then the way in which several of the characters lead us through stories. That we have a lead character, one of which, and thank you for talking about the child, but it's also the thing that is related to that is of the reform school,
right?
And this whole question of relating to what you've just said of what do we do? We're the people who've been told we're trash and worthless. The teachers even saying that, and there is this arc of their united in resistance. Understanding of each other, and the way in which they point out, well, I may hate you as my father, but guess what? You're the only present father, and so you have the building of the loyalty out of that particular plot line. So in this randomness of the chronicle structure, because it is set up as a kind of chronicle, what happened over the four days. there is some real plotting that's put in. This plotting design there. The design, in a certain sense, is to convince us of the fact that we're just seeing collective action. But if you step back from the film, yeah, we are seeing that. But in this, Ashley put it, highly selected and arranged way that has this rising power in the film as you see the rising energy of the citizens and the resistance. I mean, if you wanted a patriotic Italian film, I think we found it.
Yeah, I would definitely say so, right? That theme does come up again in another film, Italia Brava Gente, right? That also kind of Giampiero Brunetta discusses when in his work on Italian cinema. He discusses these two films together.
Okay.
And I should say also that it was very hard to find information on this film. I think, you know, I went digging back to my sources, my trusted sources in Italian film history, and found nothing.
Yeah.
I found the original New York Times review, which was glowing. I mean,
absolutely.
Bosley Crowther gave it a wonderful review, and then you mentioned the Academy Award nominations. I don't know about box office receipts, but getting back to the narrative and what you were talking about, there is a tendency in Italian cinema for episodic structures.
Right.
Okay, so we have a whole series of films in the 40s and the 50s that are actually anthologies, right? Where you have one short film by one director, and then another one,
right,
and then another one. And they tell sort of the same story. Or, I mean, even we go back to Paisan, right? Paisan is the story of the liberation of Italy from Sicily all the way up to the north.
In units with different groups of people. We go from unit to unit to unit, but in an episodic anthology fashion.
Correct. And, you know, if there is one thread throughout these, throughout this film, it's certainly Naples.
Right.
It's the city. And the city is the star, right?
Oh, thank you. Talk more about that, yeah.
So it is the story of Naples. It is the story of the people of Naples who rebelled. And I'm trying to think, we see very few interiors in shots in this film. I mean, there's the one where the soldier comes home, and I mean, that was such a wonderful scene when the soldier comes home and he's so exhausted, and then 10 minutes later, he's awoken and rounded up, right? And you feel his exhaustion.
Absolutely.
Right? And I think that's something also about the way that this film is shot is the pathos that emerges, the effective quality of this film, which you don't necessarily get in some of the early neorealist films because they are more interested in the story, right? In telling the true story. Here they are telling a true story, but the reality, right, or the reality effect is almost more emotional, I think.
Oh, I think it's very, very well observed. You know, it is a highly evocative film. I would say that's related to its sense of place and its materialism about the relationship that the people have to the place. I'm going to come back to the example you just used. People are saying, we don't have weapons. Oh, but we do have weapons. We can drop a bed out of a window. You know, that's a weapon.
Right.
And so there's that sense of, you know, invention on their part, but that we're so close to their experience of their city, because it is a great city film. It's a great film about Naples, but it's a great city film by any standard. It is a kind of city symphony of resistance, and we could teach it with all the other films that are city symphony in some way, where you say that the city is the protagonist, and this certainly fits into that category.
Yeah, I would also say that it does go back to the importance of the everyday. Right?
Okay.
So if we talk about neorealism, neorealism wanted to depict life as it happens every day, right? Where the camera would be a window onto the world. Like that's a Cesare Zavattini idea, who was one of the great thinkers of Italian neorealism and a screenwriter as well, and director too. So if we're looking at the experience of the everyday, I think it's wonderful that we also see everyday objects.
Correct.
In the resistance, right? I mean, they have fantastic guns and tanks and things, but they use furniture, or they use what they have,
Right.
and the sharing of the bread and the food and the potatoes, right? Those are everyday experiences that people during the war had
Right.
and suffered from. And it's just so emotionally stirring, right? This was Nanni Loy's I think this was that's the director, right?
Right.
So it was his, I think, the third or fourth film. He had made a previous film called sort of A Day of the Lion, Un Giorno
Right.
da Leone, and it was also a resistance film, but had many comic overtones,
Okay.
right? It was more like a tutti a casa kind of thing, everybody home. And then he went on to make great comedies, especially
He's
with,
really known as a comic director insofar
Correct.
as he's canonically remembered. He's remembered as in that line of
Right.
Italian comedies
Right.
as social commentary,
Correct.
not for something of an epic war film I'll say it, a masterpiece of Italian cinema like this film itself.
Yeah, and I love that you use the word epic, because it is an epic, right? It tells a human story in great proportions, with these grandiose proportions,
Right.
with a resonance for today,
Right.
right? And I think it's important, right, that a film like this gets released, during a time of intense prosperity in Italy and growth. And so what kind of message, right, is that sending to the Italian people, right? It's saying, remember what we really fought for here.
Right.
Right? Let's, yay, La Dolce Vita's great, and, you can have your cars and your Vespas and your Olivetti typewriters. But remember the ideals of the resistance.
There is the ideals of resistance, and there's also I'm not going to call it nostalgia, but it's a recalling to the fact that, wait a minute, there's a particular form of social ability that is being a Neapolitan urban person, and looked at the way in which that form of social ability was purposed towards the resistance. And now maybe we're losing that, or there's a threat of losing that. So we really need to recover those. It's a core set of values in the in the end that are worth preserving, and that may be at risk. Ironically enough, given the prosperity that was on the rise at that particular moment.
I would definitely agree.
Okay, good. And we're going to have to leave in a second, but just give me one little idea about the relationship between this and a masterpiece called The Battle of Algiers.
Oh, boy. It's been a long time since I've seen that one.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what. What I'm going to do is I'm going to leave that as the question for our viewers. What's the relationship between The Battle of Algiers, which they should see, and the film they've just seen? Because we just ran out of time.
All right.
Okay. If you enjoyed our discussion here, you can find out more about this show and CUNY TV at www.tv.cuny.edu. You can also find out how you can communicate with us by sending email through that website, or you can download the new app for CUNY TV. So visit www.tv.cuny.edu. Jackie, always a pleasure to chat with you.
Thank you so much for having me back and for introducing me to this amazing film.
Thank you so much. Join us here again on City Cinematheque as we continue to explore neorealism and all kinds of other things as we stroll through the archives of film history. Bye for now.